My university friend Takeshi invited me to his hometown's harvest festival, but some traditions are better left undisturbed. It was October 2019, and I needed to escape the chaos of Tokyo for a weekend. Takeshi's village was tucked deep in the mountains of Gifu Prefecture. 3 hours by train, then another hour by bus through winding mountain road. The kind of place where cell phone signals die and time moves differently. When I arrived, the village was buzzing with preparation for their annual harvest. Red and gold banners hung between traditional wooden houses. The sweet smell of burning incense mixed with autumn leaves filled the air. Everything seemed too perfect. That evening, Takeshi's grandmother served us dinner in their traditional home. She was ancient, with clouded eyes that seemed to look right through me. When I mentioned how excited I was for the festival, she went completely silent. Her chopsticks clattered to the table. In broken English, she whispered, "Outsiders should not watch the dance." Takeshi quickly changed the subject, but his grandmother's words echoed in my mind. The next day, the festival began at sunset. Villagers gathered at the shrine at the center of town, wearing traditional Yokai. Taiko drums echoed through the valley as the ceremony began. Everything was beautiful until the sun completely disappeared. The moment darkness fell, the entire atmosphere changed. The villagers' faces became expressionless, vacant. They began to form a circle around a massive bonfire. The drumming grew faster and more frantic. Then they started to dance. But this wasn't any traditional folk dance I'd ever seen. Their movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by invisible string. I looked for Takeshi, but he was dancing too, his eyes completely white. As the dance continued, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There were more dancers in the circle than there were people in the village. Some of the figures were translucent, flickering. Their yukata were from different eras, some ancient, some modern, all dancing the same impossible dance. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. The ghostly dancers began to turn toward me, smiling. Their mouths opened wider than humanly possible. I felt an overwhelming urge to join them, to dance forever. Somehow I broke free and ran back to Takeshi's house. I packed my things and caught the first bus out at dawn. Takeshi never returned to Tokyo. When I called his university, they said he dropped out. But sometimes, on Harvest Moon night, I still feel the urge to dance. Last summer, I attended a Bon festival where the children's lanterns led me somewhere I should never have followed. I was working as an ALT in a small town in Shimane Prefecture, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and some things are never spoken about. August 15th was Obon, the festival to honor the dead. My students had been excitedly telling me about it for weeks, how their ancestors' spirits would return for 3 days, how they would light lanterns to guide them home. It sounded beautiful, and it was at first. The festival began at the old cemetery on the hill. Families gathered with paper lanterns, offerings, and incense. The children were especially excited, carrying small, colorful lanterns. Their laughter echoed through the evening air as they ran between the graves. But as darkness fell, I noticed something odd. There were more children carrying lanterns than I remembered from earlier. Some of them I didn't recognize at all. They were dressed in old-fashioned yukata, different from the others. When I asked my colleague about them, she just smiled nervously. Sometimes, extra children come to play during Obon, I whispered. Around 9 o'clock, the children began to form a procession. They walked in a line, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies, singing a song I'd never heard before. The melody was haunting, almost hypnotic. I followed them, curious about where they were going. The procession led away from the cemetery toward the old part of town, past abandoned houses with broken windows and overgrown gardens. The children's song grew louder, more urgent. They stopped in front of a house that had been destroyed in a fire decades ago. Only the foundation remained, covered in weeds and ash. The children placed their lanterns in a perfect circle around the ruins. Then they began to play games I couldn't quite understand. Ring around the rosy, but the words were different. Hide and seek, but some children never reappeared. As I watched, I realized with growing horror, some of the children were becoming more and more transparent. Their laughter was fading, becoming echoes, while others were becoming more solid, more real. One of my students, little Yuki, was among them. She turned to look at me with eyes that weren't quite her own anymore. "Sensei," she called softly, "come play with me." Her voice had an otherworldly quality, multiple voices speaking as one. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. The next morning, I asked about the house that had burned down. My colleague's face went pale. 7 children had died in that fire 50 years ago. Every year during Obon, they came back to play. And sometimes, they convinced living children to stay with them forever. When I got lost, driving through rural Kyushu, I stumbled upon a festival that officially ended 50 years ago. It was late October, and I was driving back to Fukuoka after a business. My GPS had died somewhere in the mountains, and my phone had no signal. The narrow mountain roads all looked the same in the darkness. Endless curves through thick forests, no streetlights, no sign. I'd been driving for hours when I saw lights ahead. Bright, colorful lights that seemed completely out of place. As I got closer, I could hear music, traditional festival music. I rounded a curve and found myself in a small village. Paper lanterns hung everywhere, casting warm light on wooden buildings. Food stalls lined the main street, selling yakitori and takoyaki. People in colorful yukata wandered between the stalls, laughing and talking. It was like stepping into a postcard, or back in time. I parked and got out, grateful to finally find civilization. The festival seemed to be in full swing, despite it being nearly midnight. I approached a takoyaki stand, my stomach growling. The vendor was an elderly man with a kind smile. But when I looked closer, his eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just endless darkness. He handed me a container of takoyaki and refused payment. "First time at our festival?" he asked, his voice echoing strangely. I nodded, too unsettled to speak. He smiled wider, too wide. "Then you must stay for the midnight ceremony." As I walked through the festival, I began to notice more disturbing details. Everyone had the same black eyes, the same too wide smile. Their movements were slightly off, delayed, like actors who had forgotten their cue. The children playing games moved in perfect synchronization. The musicians played without seeming to breathe, and no one cast a shadow, despite the bright lantern light. I tried to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The key turned, but the engine just wouldn't respond. As midnight approached, bells began to ring from a shrine I hadn't noticed before. The festival goers all turned toward the sound in perfect unison. They began walking toward the shrine, their movements mechanical. I followed, unable to resist the pull. At the shrine, they formed a circle around an ancient altar. On it sat a blackened, twisted thing that might once have been human. The crowd began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. Their voices rose and fell in an impossible harmony. As they chanted, their forms began to fade, becoming translucent. The festival lights dimmed, the music distorted into something hellish. Somehow my car started on the first try. I drove until dawn, not daring to look back. Later I researched the area online. That village had been abandoned after a terrible fire in 1974. 50 people had died during their annual harvest festival, the last festival they ever held, or so they thought. I was documenting traditional Japanese festivals for my doctoral thesis when I witnessed a ceremony that should have died out centuries ago. The village of Higashino was perfect for my research. Remote, traditional, and still practicing rice cultivation methods from the Edo period. The village headman Tanaka-san had agreed to let me document their annual rice festival. He was ancient, probably in his 90s, with wrinkled hands and clouded eyes. But when he spoke about the festival, his voice carried a weight I couldn't understand. "You may watch," he said, "but you must not interfere no matter what you see." I arrived in early November, just as the rice harvest was complete. The village was preparing for their Nina Meisai, the rice Thanksgiving festival. Everything seemed normal at first. Traditional decorations, offerings prepared for the kami. But I noticed the villagers spoke in hushed tones when they thought I couldn't hear. Children were kept indoors after sunset, and there was an air of dread that seemed to grow stronger each day. The festival began at dawn on November 23rd. The villagers gathered at the old shrine that overlooked the rice field. They carried the first fruits of their harvest, rice, vegetables, sake. Everything proceeded normally through the morning ceremony. Prayers were offered, offerings were made to ensure next year's harvest. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere changed completely. Tanaka-san produced an ancient scroll, so old it was falling apart. He began reading in classical Japanese, words I could barely understand. But the meaning became clear as the ceremony progressed. They were calling something hungry. The rice fields below us began to rustle, though there was no wind. The golden stalks swayed in pattern, like something massive was moving beneath them. The villagers' chanting grew louder, more urgent. Then Tanaka-san gestured toward a young man I'd seen helping with preparation. Kenji, maybe 20 years old, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He stepped forward without hesitation, like he'd been expecting this. The other villagers placed wreaths of rice stalks around his neck. They painted symbols on his face with what looked like blood mixed with rice wine. I started to realize what was happening and tried to intervene, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground. Kenji walked calmly down the hill toward the rice field. As he entered the field, the rustling grew violent, aggressive. The rice stalks wrapped around his leg, pulling him deeper. He never cried out, never struggled. He just disappeared beneath the golden wave. The fields fell silent. Tanaka-san turned to me with those clouded eyes. "The rice god must eat," he said simply, "or we all starve." I left that night despite their protest. When I tried to report what I'd seen, no one believed me. The village wasn't on any official map. Kenji's disappearance was never reported. But last month I received a package with no return address. Inside was a bag of rice and a simple note. "Thank you for not interfering. Next year's harvest was exceptional." I threw the rice away, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear Kenji calling my name from the field. On New Year's Eve 2022, I attended a celebration in rural Tohoku where midnight never and the year never changed. I was staying at a traditional ryokan in Iwate Prefecture for the holiday. The owner, Sato-san, had invited me to join the village's New Year celebration. "It's a very old tradition," he said with a strange smile. The village was small, maybe 50 houses scattered along a frozen valley. Snow-covered mountains surrounded us on all sides. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move different. The celebration began at the village shrine just before 11 p.m. Everyone was there, families with children, elderly couples, young adults. They carried sake, mochi, and offerings for the new year. The shrine bells rang 107 times, one short of the traditional 108. When I asked about this, the shrine keeper just shook his head. The 108th bell, he saved that for the end. As we waited for midnight, I noticed my watch wasn't working properly. The hands seemed to be moving backwards. 11:58, 11:56. I thought it was broken, but when I looked around, everyone else's watches and phones showed the same thing. Time was flowing backward. The villagers didn't seem concerned about this at all. They continued their prayers and celebrations as if nothing was wrong. But I noticed other changes as the night progressed. The children were growing younger before my eyes. Teenagers becoming children, children becoming toddlers. The elderly were losing their wrinkles, their hair darkening. Everyone was aging in reverse. When my watch reached 11, then 10:30, then 10, I realized what was happening. They weren't celebrating the new year, they were preventing. By reversing time, they could stay in the old year forever. Never aging, never changing, never dying. But as I watched the villagers growing younger and younger, I realized the terrible cost of this eternal celebration. When time reached 9 p.m., some of the elderly had become teenagers. At 8 p.m., they were children. At 7 p.m., they were toddlers, crying in confusion. The shrine keeper, now a young man in his 20s, began the final ritual. He raised his hand toward the shrine bell, the 108th ring. I understood that this would reset everything, start the cycle over. The villagers would age backward to nothing, then be reborn to live the same year again, forever trapped in an endless New Year's Eve. But I was an outsider. The spell wouldn't hold me. I ran from the shrine as the final bell began to toll. Behind me I heard the villagers, not celebrating, but screaming, the sound of people being erased and reborn, again and again. I made it to my car just as my watch hit midnight. Time snapped forward like a rubber band. 2023 arrived all at once. When I looked back at the village, all the lights were off. The houses looked abandoned, like they had been for decades. But sometimes, on very quiet New Year's Eve, I can still hear that 108th bell ringing somewhere in the distance. And I wonder if they're still there, trapped in their perfect, endless celebration, living the same night forever.